Dark clouds threatened rain as Maxwell Reed's luxury sedan pulled up in front of Lincoln Elementary School. The imposing brick building looked smaller than he remembered, its weathered facade showing decades of neglect. Max checked his platinum watch, a nervous habit he'd developed during high-stakes business meetings, and took a deep breath. 42 years had passed since he'd last walked through those doors. "Are you sure you don't want me to wait, Mr. Reed?" his driver asked, eyeing the deteriorating neighborhood with thinly veiled concern. "No need, Thomas. This might take a while. I'll call when I'm ready," Max replied, his voice betraying more emotion than he intended. He straightened his custom-tailored suit, a reflex more than a necessity, and stepped onto the cracked sidewalk. The air felt heavy with memories as raindrops began to fall, mirroring the storm of emotions brewing inside him. At 60, Maxwell Reed was one of the most successful real estate developers on the East Coast. Business magazines called him the architect of modern Manhattan, a title he'd once coveted but now felt strangely hollow. His return to Westbridge, the small working-class suburb of Boston where he grew up, wasn't planned. A cryptic email about the school's upcoming demolition had triggered something deep within him, a pull he couldn't explain or ignore. Max hesitated at the entrance, his hand resting on the worn metal handle of the door. Through the glass, he could see the familiar green and white checkerboard tiles of the main hallway. For a moment he was 10 years old again, a scrawny kid with worn-out sneakers and too big clothes from the donation bin, trying to make himself invisible. The door creaked as he opened it, the sound echoing down the empty corridor. School was out for the day, but administrative staff would still be working. He had called ahead mentioning a potential donation, which was all it took to secure a private tour. Money always opened doors, a lesson he'd learned early and wielded effectively throughout his adult life. "Mr. Reed?" a woman's voice called from the end of the hallway. The principal, Dr. Eleanor Wilkins, according to their email exchange, approached with an outstretched hand. "We're so honored to have you visit your alma mater. Though I must admit, we were surprised to hear from someone of your prominence." Max shook her hand firmly. "The honor is mine, Dr. Wilkins. I hope I'm not interrupting your afternoon." "Not at all, though I should warn you, things have changed since your time here. Budget cuts have not been kind to public education," she said, gesturing to the water, stains on the ceiling and the outdated equipment visible through classroom windows. "Some things never change," Max remarked dryly. "Lincoln Elementary was struggling even in my day." Dr. Wilkins led him through the main corridor, pointing out renovations and explaining the school's current programs. Max nodded politely, but his attention was elsewhere, searching for ghosts of his past in every corner. The trophy case still stood in the same spot, though the achievements it displayed were more recent. The cafeteria doors were now painted blue instead of red. Small changes layered over the familiar, like sediment covering ancient artifacts. As they turned toward the library, Max stopped abruptly. Down a dimly lit hallway, an elderly woman was slowly mopping the floor. Her back was bent with age, her movements labored but methodical. Something about her silhouette struck him with the force of recognition. "Is that—" he began, his voice suddenly failing him. Dr. Wilkins followed his gaze. "Oh, that's just Rose Hawkins. She's been with Lincoln Elementary forever. Actually, she should have retired years ago, but—" She lowered her voice. "Her family situation is complicated, and we make accommodations where we can." Max stood frozen, watching the old woman work. "How old is she?" he asked quietly. 85, if you can believe it. Refuses to stop working even though her health isn't what it used to be. Dr. Wilkins shook her head. "She's something of an institution here. The children adore her." "Would you mind if I spoke with her?" Max asked, already moving toward the elderly custodian. Dr. Wilkins looked surprised but nodded. "So of course, I have some calls to make anyway. Take your time. I'll be in my office when you're ready to continue the tour." Max approached slowly, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. The sound alerted Rose, who turned with difficulty, leaning heavily on her mop. "Sorry about that," she said, her voice raspier than he remembered but undeniably hers. "Floor's still wet. Careful now. Wouldn't want you slipping in that nice suit." Rose squinted up at him. her eyes clouded with cataracts but still that distinctive hazel color that had once looked at a frightened child with such kindness. He could tell she didn't recognize him, and why would she? The skinny, troubled boy with a perpetual scowl had been transformed by time, success, and expensive grooming into someone unrecognizable even to himself sometimes. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said softly, "it's been a long time." She tilted, her head, confusion crossing her weathered features. "Do I know you, mister?" "Maxwell Reed, though you used to call me Max when you found me hiding in the janitor's closet during recess." Her eyes widened and the mop clattered to the floor. "Little Max? Heavens above, little Max Reed?" Her gnarled hands came up to cover her mouth. "Lord have mercy, look at you, all grown up and fancy as can be." Before he could respond, she did something that no one had done to Maxwell Reed, CEO and billionaire in decades. She hugged him. The smell of pine cleaner and the same rose-scented lotion she'd always worn enveloped him, triggering a cascade of memories. Rose Hawkins had been the only person at Lincoln Elementary who saw past his anger, past the dirty clothes and unwashed hair of a boy whose mother worked 3 jobs and whose father had abandoned them. She had slipped him sandwiches when he came to school hungry, taught him how to tie a tie for his first school concert, and most importantly, told him repeatedly that he was worth something when everyone else had written him off as a lost cause. "Look at you," she repeated, stepping back to examine him. "I always knew you'd make something of yourself, always knew it." Max felt his carefully constructed composure begin to crack. "And look at you, Mrs. Hawkins, still here after all this time." "Where else would I be?" She chuckled, but it turned into a cough that shook her thin frame. Once the coughing subsided, she added, "Some of us aren't meant for bigger things. We're just meant to help others get there." "You shouldn't be working at your age," Max said, noticing the tremor in her hands as she picked up her mop. Rose shrugged. "Bills don't pay themselves, and my Emily needs her treatments." "Emily?" "My granddaughter, special needs, that one. Sweet as sugar but needs extra care. Her mama, my daughter, passed away 5 years ago, so it's just me looking after her now." The weight of her words hit Max hard. This woman who had shown him more kindness than anyone in his childhood was still struggling, still sacrificing at an age when she should be resting. "Let me help you with that," Max said, reaching for the mop, but Rose pulled it away with surprising strength. "Now don't you go feeling sorry for me, Maxwell Reed. I've had a good life, maybe not an easy one, but a good one, and I'm proud of every minute of it." Her chin lifted defiantly, that familiar spark of determination in her eyes. Max raised his hands in surrender, a genuine smile breaking through his usually guarded expression. "I wouldn't dream of it, Mrs. Hawkins." They talked for nearly an hour, right there in the hallway. Rose told him about her decades at the school, the changes she'd witnessed, the thousands of children she'd seen grow up. Max shared sanitized versions of his journey from Westbridge to Harvard Business School to the top of the real estate world. What he didn't share was how empty his achievements felt, how his penthouse overlooking Central Park echoed with silence, or how he'd sacrificed every meaningful relationship on the altar of his ambition. As their conversation wound down, Dr. Wilkins reappeared, clearly impatient to continue the tour and, more importantly, discuss potential donations. Max nodded politely but turned back to Rose. "It was wonderful seeing you again, Mrs. Hawkins. I won't keep you from your work any longer. You come back and visit an old lady again before you disappear for another 40 years, you hear?" Rose said, patting his arm affectionately. "I promise," Max replied, surprised to find he meant it. As he followed Dr. Wilkins toward her office, Max glanced back at Rose, who had resumed her mopping with the same quiet dignity she'd always possessed. Something shifted inside him, a realization that all his wealth and power had done nothing to help the one person who had believed in him when it mattered most. By the time he left Lincoln Elementary an hour later, Maxwell Reed had made his decision. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. He took a deep breath of the damp air and pulled out his phone. "Rebecca," he said to his executive assistant, "clear my calendar for the next few months. Something's come up, something important." 2. Weeks after his unexpected reunion with Rose Hawkins, Maxwell Reed sat in the conference room of his Manhattan office, surrounded by his bewildered executive team. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he had helped shape, but Max's attention was fixed on the digital presentation before him. "Let me get this straight," said Victor Hargrove, his CFO of 15 years. "You want to establish a foundation for elderly support. Staff in public schools? Starting with this Westbridge area?" His tone made it clear what he thought of the proposal. "Not just want to, Victor, I'm going to," Max replied, his voice carrying the same authoritative edge that had closed billion-dollar deals. The Reed Foundation for Educational Support Staff will provide retirement benefits, healthcare supplements, and housing assistance to qualifying individuals who have dedicated their lives to our schools but been left behind by the system. Victor exchanged glances with Charlotte Weiss, Max's legal counsel. Charlotte cleared her throat. "Max, while the philanthropic angle is admirable, there are more strategic ways to approach charitable giving, ways that would better align with Reed Enterprises' brand and business interests." Max leaned forward, his steely gaze moving from one executive to another. These were people who had never questioned his business acumen, who had followed his often ruthless directives without hesitation. Their discomfort, now, was palpable. "This isn't about brand alignment or tax write-offs," he said quietly. "For once, this is about doing something that matters." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, Rebecca Chen, his executive assistant and the person who perhaps knew him best, spoke up. "I think what everyone is trying to say, Mr. Reed, is that this seems uncharacteristically personal." Max's jaw tightened. She was right, of course. In 20 years, he had never allowed personal sentiments to influence business decisions. His detachment was legendary, the reason they called him the Iceman behind his back, though they thought he didn't know. "Personal or not, the decision is made," he stated firmly. "I've allocated $50 million from my personal accounts to start. Charlotte, I need the legal framework by the end of the week. Rebecca, find me a place to stay in Westbridge, something modest but comfortable for an extended visit. I'll be working remotely for the foreseeable future." The stunned expressions around the table might have amused him on another day. Today he merely stood, straightened his cuffs, another nervous habit, and walked out, leaving his team to absorb the seismic shift in their usually predictable boss. 3 days later, Max found himself in Dr. Wilkins' office at Lincoln, Elementary, outlining his proposal. Unlike his executive team who had questioned his motives, Dr. Wilkins questioned his sincerity. "Mr. Reed," she said, her academic tone barely masking her skepticism, "while your offer sounds generous, I have to wonder why a man of your position would suddenly take such interest in our humble institution and its staff, particularly someone like Rose Hawkins." Max had anticipated resistance, but was surprised by its source. "Does it matter why, as long as the outcome benefits your school and your people?" he asked. Dr. Wilkins leaned back in her chair, studying him. "In my experience, Mr. Reed, motives always matter, especially when they involve vulnerable communities. Westbridge has seen its share of developers swooping in with grand promises, only to gentrify neighborhoods and displace the very people they claim to help." The accusations stung, partly because there was truth to it. Reed Enterprises had been involved in several urban development projects that had indeed resulted in gentrification. Max had never lost sleep over it before. Progress had costs, he'd always reasoned. "This isn't about development, Dr. Wilkins. There are no hidden agendas or real estate plays. This is about repaying a debt I owe to Mrs. Hawkins and, by extension, to this community." He found himself sharing more than he'd intended. "She was the only person who believed in me when I was here, the only one who saw something in me worth saving." Dr. Wilkins' expression softened slightly, but her posture remained guarded. "Noble sentiments, Mr. Reed, but forgive me if I require more than words. Westbridge has heard plenty of those over the years." "Fair enough," Max conceded. "What would convince you of my sincerity?" She considered for a moment. "Start small. Before launching foundations and making grandiose promises, Show me you understand the actual needs of our community. Spend time here. Listen to people like Rose instead of making assumptions about what they need. It wasn't the response he'd expected. Maxwell Reed wasn't accustomed to starting small or being patient. His success had been built on bold moves and quick results. But something about Dr. Wilkins' challenge resonated with him. Agreed, he said finally. I'll take the time to do this right. As he left the office, Max checked his phone to find several messages from his office, crises that would normally demand his immediate attention. He silenced the device and slipped it into his pocket. For the first time in decades, Reed Enterprises would have to wait. Max found Rose in the school cafeteria, wiping down tables after lunch. Her movements were slow, methodical, and clearly painful. He watched from the doorway for a moment, struck by how small she looked in the large room, how the fluorescent lights highlighted the deep lines on her face. "Mrs. Hawkins," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, a smile brightening her tired features. "Well, look who kept his promise, Maxwell Reed back again so soon." "I told you I would be," he said, approaching. "Are you finished here? Could I take you to lunch?" Rose laughed, the sound surprisingly youthful. "Lunch? It's nearly 3 in the afternoon, Max." "Late lunch then, or early dinner, whatever you'd prefer to call it." She studied him, her head tilted curiously. "You're serious, aren't you? Mr. Big Shot wants to have a meal with the cleaning lady. I'd like to catch up properly, somewhere more comfortable than a school hallway or cafeteria." Rose considered this, then nodded toward a small office off the kitchen. "Let me get my things." 10 minutes later, they were seated at Mabel's Diner, a local establishment untouched by time. The vinyl booths were cracked, the Formica tabletops worn smooth by decades of use, but the place was immaculately clean and smelled of fresh coffee and homemade pie. "Best apple pie in Massachusetts," Rose declared as they settled into a corner booth. "Been coming here since before you were born." The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Darla, approached with familiar warmth. "Rose, twice in 1 month, must be a special occasion." Her curious gaze shifted to Max in his tailored suit, clearly out of place, among the diner's regular clientele. "Just catching up with an old friend," Rose explained. "Darla, this is Maxwell Reed. He was one of my kids at Lincoln, though that was a lifetime ago." Darla's eyes widened in recognition. "Reed? As in Reed Enterprises? The skyscrapers guy from the magazines?" Max nodded uncomfortably. "That would be me." "Well, I'll be," Darla said, looking impressed. "Rose always said her kids would make something of themselves. Guess she was right about you." To Rose, she added, "The usual, hun?" "Please," Rose confirmed. "And whatever my guest wants, put it on my tab." Max began to protest, but Rose silenced him with a look so reminiscent of his childhood that he immediately stopped. Some authority transcended wealth and status. "I'll have whatever Mrs. Hawkins is having," he told Darla, who nodded and bustled away. "You'll have meatloaf then," Rose informed him. "Monday's meatloaf day at Mabel's." "Perfect," Max said, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something as pedestrian as meatloaf. His usual diet consisted of carefully prepared, nutritionist-approved meals or business dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. Once they were alone, Rose folded her weathered hands on the table. "So what brings you back to Westbridge so soon, Max? And don't tell me it's the pleasure of my company, though that would be a nice touch." Max found himself hesitating. He'd prepared a carefully crafted explanation of his foundation idea, one that would position it as a general philanthropic venture rather than a specific response to her situation. But sitting across from Rose's direct gaze, the practiced speech felt inadequate. "I want to help you, Mrs. Hawkins," he said simply. "You shouldn't be working at your age, especially with a dependent granddaughter." Rose's expression hardened. "Slightly. I don't need charity, Maxwell." "It's not charity," he insisted. "You helped me when no one else would. Let me return the favor." Her eyes, despite the cataracts clouding them, seemed to see straight through him. "Return the favor? Is that what this is about? Clearing your conscience?" The question hit uncomfortably close to the truth. Was this about Rose or about his own need for redemption? Before he could formulate a response, Darla returned with 2 plates of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans. "Enjoy, folks," she said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension at the table. Rose said a quick grace before picking up her fork, a habit Max remembered from childhood when she'd shared her lunch with him. He waited until she took a bite before doing the same, surprised to find the simple food remarkably good. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Rose spoke again, her tone gentler. "Tell me about Emily, your granddaughter," Max prompted. Rose's face transformed, love replacing wariness. "My Emily's 19 now, born with cerebral palsy, but sharp as a tack. Sweetest girl you've ever met." She pulled out her wallet, removing a slightly bent photograph of a young woman in a wheelchair, her smile wide and genuine despite her clearly challenging physical condition. "She looks like you," Max observed, noting the same hazel eyes and determined set of the jaw. "She's got her mother's laugh, though," Rose said, a shadow of grief crossing her features. "My daughter Sandra was diagnosed with cancer 5 years ago. Went quick, too quick for any of us to prepare. Left Emily in my care." "And no other family to help?" Max asked carefully. Rose shook her head. "Sandra was divorced. Emily's father hasn't been in the picture since she was 2. My son lives in California, has his own family, his own struggles, sends money when he can, but..." She trailed off, the implication clear. "What about healthcare? Doesn't Emily qualify for assistance programs?" "Some," Rose acknowledged, "but there's always something not covered. Specialized equipment, therapy programs, medications. The bureaucracy alone is enough to drive you crazy. And now they're talking about cutting the very programs she depends on." Max listened intently as Rose detailed the labyrinthine challenges of navigating healthcare and social services for a disabled dependent. His mind, trained to identify inefficiencies and opportunities, was already cataloging problems that could be addressed with the right resources and influence. "And you?" he asked. "Your own health, your retirement?" Rose laughed, though there was little humor in it. "Retirement? That's for people with pension plans and 401ks, Max. I've been working at Lincoln since I was 20. Back then, support staff didn't get benefits like teachers did. By the time the laws changed, I was classified as a legacy employee with a different set of rules. I get Social Security, but between rent, food, and Emily's needs, it's nowhere near enough." The injustice of it struck Max with unexpected force. Here was a woman who had dedicated her entire life to serving others, who had shaped the lives of thousands of children, including himself, reduced to mopping floors at 85 just to survive. "It's not right," he said, unable to keep the anger from his voice. "Life rarely is," Rose replied with the quiet wisdom. Curve someone who had long ago accepted this truth. "But we make do with what we've got. Always have." As their meal concluded, and Max insisted on paying despite Rose's protests, he made a silent vow. He would do more than just make do for Rose Hawkins. He would ensure that her remaining years were lived with the dignity and comfort she deserved. What he didn't realize yet was how this mission would transform not just Rose's life, but his own. 1 month into his stay in Westbridge, Maxwell Reed was discovering that wealth and influence couldn't solve everything. He sat in his rented townhouse, modest by his standards but still the most upscale residence in the neighborhood, reviewing a frustrating email from his legal team. "Impossible," he muttered, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. The structural assessment of Lincoln Elementary had come back worse than anticipated. The building wasn't just deteriorating, it was unsafe. Asbestos in the walls, outdated electrical systems, and foundation issues that would cost millions to repair. The school board had already voted to close it at the end of the semester, with plans to bus students to neighboring districts. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Max opened it to find Sarah Jenkins, a local real estate agent he'd hired to gather information about the neighborhood. "Morning, Mr. Reed," she greeted him with professional brightness. "I've got those property reports you requested." "Come in," he replied, leading her to his makeshift office in the dining room. "And please, it's just Max." Sarah, A sharp woman in her 40s with practical clothes and no-nonsense demeanor laid out several folders on the table. I've compiled everything, as requested: property values, ownership histories, recent sales, and pending developments. She hesitated. You should know there's already significant developer interest in the school property. Rumors say Pinnacle Development has been courting the district for months. Max frowned. Pinnacle was one of his competitors, known for building high-end condominiums in up-and-coming areas. What's their angle? Location. Westbridge is the last affordable area within commuting distance of Boston. The school sits on 5 acres, prime real estate for luxury apartments. And the existing residents? Sarah shrugged. The usual story. Rising property taxes force them to sell. Neighborhood revitalization prices them out of their homes. They move further out, start the cycle again. Max felt a familiar discomfort. How many times had Reed Enterprises been on the other side of this equation? How many neighborhoods had he revitalized, never considering the human cost of progress? There has to be a better option, he said, more to himself than to Sarah. She studied him curiously. Forgive my bluntness, Mr. Reed, Max, but isn't this exactly what your company does? Buy undervalued properties, develop them into luxury, spaces, sell at premium prices? It is, he admitted, or it was. Sarah waited for him to elaborate, and when he didn't, she continued professionally. Well, if you're looking at investment opportunities in Westbridge, these are your best options. She pointed to several highlighted properties on a map. Though I should warn you, locals are already suspicious of outside investors. There's been talk about you at the Chamber of Commerce meetings. What kind of talk? Speculation about why Maxwell Reed would suddenly take interest in a forgotten place like Westbridge. Most assume you're scouting for your next big development. Max nodded, unsurprised. And what do you think, Sarah? She hesitated, weighing her words. I think a man doesn't rent a townhouse and spend weeks in a declining suburb if all he wants is to build condos. But I also think people here have good reason to be wary. They've been promised improvements before, only to be pushed out when those improvements raise the cost of living. Fair assessment, Max conceded. Thank you for your candor and for these reports. They'll be helpful. After Sarah left, Max returned to his laptop, the school building problem weighing heavily on his mind. The closure timeline gave him less than 4 months to find a solution that would save not just Rose's job, but the educational heart of the community. His phone buzzed with a reminder. Emily's medical appointment. Rose had finally agreed to let him accompany them to a specialist he'd arranged in Boston. Grabbing his keys, Max headed out, his mind still churning with potential solutions to the school's imminent closure. No, absolutely not, Rose was saying as Max entered the waiting room of Boston Medical Center's neurology department. Her voice, though lowered, carried the unmistakable edge of someone fighting a losing battle with bureaucracy. The receptionist, a young woman with apologetic eyes, repeated what was clearly a practiced explanation. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hawkins, but without prior authorization from your insurance, we can't proceed with the full evaluation today. Dr. Stevens can do an initial consultation, but the comprehensive testing package... It's been 3 weeks since... We submitted the paperwork, Rose interrupted, her frustration evident. 3 weeks of phone calls and emails and getting nowhere. Max approached quietly, placing a supportive hand on Rose's shoulder. Is there a problem? Emily, seated in her wheelchair beside her grandmother, looked up at Max with a warm smile. Despite the tension. In the month since he'd met her, Max had grown fond of Rose's granddaughter. Despite her physical limitations and the challenges she faced daily, Emily possessed a sharp wit and artistic talent that impressed him. Insurance red tape, Rose explained tersely. Apparently, the specialized evaluation we scheduled isn't covered without prior authorization, which they haven't processed yet. Max turned to the receptionist. I'm Maxwell Reed, a friend of the family. Perhaps I can help resolve this. He pulled out his wallet. The evaluation will be covered privately, whatever it costs. The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition. Mr. Reed, we have protocols. I understand, Max said smoothly, sliding his platinum card across the counter. But surely those protocols include provisions for private payment. Please charge whatever is necessary to ensure Emily receives the full evaluation today, as scheduled. 15 minutes and several manager consultations later, they were escorted to an examination room. Emily maneuvered her wheelchair with practiced ease, glancing back at Max with a knowing look. "You enjoy doing that, don't you?" she asked once they were alone, waiting for the doctor. "Doing what?" Max replied innocently. "Swooping in with the magic money card, making problems disappear." There was no malice in her tone, only observation. Max considered her insight. "I suppose I do. Money solves certain problems efficiently. But not all problems," Emily said wisely. "No," Max agreed, thinking of the school situation. "Not all." Rose had been uncharacteristically quiet. Now she spoke, her voice subdued. "You can't keep doing this, Max, paying for everything. We're grateful, but it's not charity," he assured her, using the same words she'd used when refusing his initial offers of help. "Consider it an investment." "In what?" Rose challenged. Before Max could answer, Dr. Stevens entered, a distinguished neurologist in his 50s. For the next 2 hours, Max observed as Emily underwent comprehensive testing. Her intelligence shone through despite the physical challenges that made certain tasks difficult. Through it all, Rose remained vigilantly attentive, anticipating Emily's needs with the intuition born from years of caregiving. It was nearly evening when they finally left the hospital, armed with preliminary results and a treatment plan that offered more hope than they'd had in years. As Max's driver navigated the Boston traffic toward Westbridge, Emily dozed in her wheelchair, exhausted from the day's exertions. "She's remarkable," Max said softly to Rose. "Her resilience, her mind. She doesn't let her condition define her." Rose gazed at her granddaughter with fierce pride. "She gets that from her mother. Sandra never let anything stop her either." Her expression clouded. "I just wish I could do more for her, provide more opportunities." "You've done everything possible, Mrs. Hawkins, more than most could manage." "It's never enough, though, is it?" Rose sighed. "As a parent or grandparent, you always feel you should be able to move mountains for them." Max understood suddenly that this was the core of Rose's resistance to his help. It wasn't pride. It was the deep-seated belief that she should be able to provide for her family without assistance. That accepting help somehow diminished her role as Emily's protector and provider. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "moving mountains requires more than one person." Rose studied him for a long moment, before nodding slightly, the closest she'd come to accepting his philosophy. As they pulled up to Rose's modest apartment building, Max noticed a group of people gathered near the entrance. Their expressions changed from concern to relief when they spotted Rose. "Oh Lord," Rose muttered. "The welcome committee." An elderly man detached himself from the group and approached the car as Max's driver helped secure Emily's wheelchair for the transfer. "Rose." "Hawkins," the man called, his voice carrying the distinctive Boston accent thickened by age. "Where have you been all day? Mabel said you took off with some stranger in a fancy car. We've been worried sick." Rose rolled her eyes but smiled affectionately. "Frank Delaney, you old busybody. I told Mabel exactly where I was going. Emily had a doctor's appointment in Boston." Frank's concerned gaze shifted to Max as he exited the car. "And who might this be?" "Maxwell Reed," Max introduced himself, extending a hand. "An old friend of Mrs. Hawkins." Frank ignored the outstretched hand, his weathered face hardening. "Reed? The developer? The one buying up properties around here?" "I'm not buying anything, Mr. Delaney," Max clarified, dropping his hand. "I'm just visiting." "Developers don't just visit places like Westbridge," Frank retorted. "Not unless they're planning something, and usually something that doesn't benefit folks like us." Others from the group had drifted closer, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Max recognized the protective instinct of a community that had learned to be suspicious of outsiders, particularly wealthy ones. "Frank, that's enough," Rose intervened. "Max is here to help, not harm. He was my student at Lincoln many years ago." This revelation caused a stir among the gathered neighbors. A woman about Rose's age pushed forward, peering at Max through thick glasses. Maggie O'Brien, she introduced herself. How you went to Lincoln when? Class of '81, Max replied. Maggie studied him intently. Reed? Maxwell Reed? Wait, not Madeline Reed's boy? The one who got the scholarship to that fancy prep school? Max was startled to hear his mother's name. Yes, that was me. Well, I'll be, Maggie said, her suspicions softening slightly. I remember your mother, hardest working woman in Westbridge, 3 jobs and still made it to every parent-teacher conference. The mention of his mother triggered a pang of emotion Max hadn't expected. Madeline Reed had passed away 10 years ago, never seeing the full extent of her son's success. She'd worked herself to exhaustion providing for him, creating opportunities. He'd seized and amplified beyond anyone's imagination. She was an extraordinary woman, Max acknowledged, his voice softening. Everything I've achieved, I owe to her sacrifices. The atmosphere shifted subtly. While not entirely welcoming, the neighbors' hostility eased as they recognized a connection to their community's past. So what exactly are you doing here, Mr. Reed? Frank persisted, though his tone had lost some of its edge. Reconnecting, Max answered honestly, and looking for ways to help preserve what makes this community special, starting with Lincoln Elementary. Lincoln? Another neighbor asked. Isn't it closing down? That's the current plan, Max confirmed, but I'm exploring alternatives. This sparked immediate interest. As Emily's wheelchair was finally situated, and Rose prepared to take her inside, Frank stepped closer to Max. If you're serious about helping Lincoln, there's a community meeting tomorrow night at St. Andrew's Church basement, 7 o'clock. Might want to hear what the locals have to say before making any grand plans. I'll be there, Max promised, helping Rose navigate the wheelchair up the building's ramp, another accommodation that appeared to have been retrofitted with minimal resources and maximum care. Inside Rose's apartment, Max was struck by the contrast between the building's shabby exterior and the immaculate, warmly decorated interior of her small 2-bedroom unit. Every surface gleamed, family photos crowded the walls, and despite the modest furnishings, there was an undeniable sense of home that his own luxury penthouse lacked. As Rose settled Emily in the living room, Max noticed a well-worn piano in the corner, sheet music open on the stand. You play? He asked Emily as Rose disappeared into the kitchen to prepare tea. Emily smiled. Not as well as I'd like. My hands don't always cooperate, but music therapy's been good for my coordination. She nodded toward several paintings propped against the wall. I prefer visual arts anyway. Max approached the canvases, genuinely impressed by what he saw. Emily's paintings captured Westbridge with extraordinary sensitivity, not just the physical structures, but the essence of community life. An elderly couple playing chess in the park, children running through sprinklers on a hot day, a neighborhood block party with tables laden with food. These are remarkable, he said. You have real talent. Thanks, Emily replied without false modesty. Art school's the dream, but... She shrugged, the gesture eloquently conveying financial impossibility. Rose returned with a tray of tea and cookies. Emily's been offered scholarships, she said proudly, but they never cover everything. Living expenses, specialized equipment, healthcare, it adds up. The wheels in Max's mind began turning. A talented young artist with barriers that were primarily financial and logistical, rather than skill-based. This was a problem he could solve. As he sipped Rose's too-sweet tea and listened to Emily's artistic aspirations, Max's phone vibrated continuously in his pocket, his executive team demanding decisions, his investors questioning his extended absence, his world wondering why Maxwell Reed had temporarily abandoned the empire he'd built. For the first time in his adult life, Max let them wonder. The problems in this small apartment and this struggling community suddenly felt more urgent, more meaningful than the billion-dollar deals awaiting his signature. The next evening found Max slipping quietly into the back of St. Andrew's Church basement, observing before making his presence known. About 50 Westbridge residents had gathered, their conversation a blend of anger and concern about Lincoln Elementary's impending closure. Dr. Wilkins stood at the front, attempting to maintain order as emotions ran high. Please understand, this isn't a decision the school made. The district assessed the building and found it unsafe. So fix it, someone called out. Our tax dollars should be going to maintaining our schools. The repairs would cost millions, Dr. Wilkins explained wearily. Money the district simply doesn't have. And with enrollment declining. It's declining because young families can't afford to live here anymore. An older woman interrupted. All these luxury developments pushing up property values. And where are our kids supposed to go? A young mother demanded. The next nearest school is 5 miles away. Max listened intently, noting how the closure represented more than just an inconvenience. It was perceived as another blow to a community already feeling the pressure of economic change. When Frank Delaney spotted him and pointedly nodded toward the front, Max knew he couldn't remain an observer. As he made his way forward, conversations hushed, attention shifting to the unexpected presence of Maxwell Reed at a community meeting. "Dr. Wilkins," Max greeted her. "May I address the group?" She hesitated, clearly uncertain whether his input would help or further inflame tensions. "Mr. Reed, I'm not sure this is the right forum." "Please," he insisted quietly. "I may have information relevant to your discussion." Reluctantly, she stepped aside, allowing him access to the makeshift podium. Max surveyed the room, recognizing faces from Rose's welcome committee the previous day, along with many others, all regarding him with varying degrees of suspicion. "Good evening," he began. "For those who don't know me, I'm Maxwell Reed. I grew up in Westbridge, attended Lincoln Elementary, and have recently returned to reconnect with the community that shaped me." "Before you owned half of Manhattan," someone called out, prompting nervous laughter. Max acknowledged this with a nod. "Yes, I've been fortunate in business, but success means little if you forget where you came from." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've reviewed the structural assessment of Lincoln Elementary. The building has serious issues that would indeed cost millions to address properly." Murmurs of disappointment rippled through the crowd. "However," Max continued, "that doesn't mean the school must close. There are alternatives worth exploring." He outlined a potential solution he'd been developing, a public-private partnership that would renovate the existing building while preserving its historical character and educational purpose. "My foundation is prepared to fund the majority of the renovation costs," he explained, with certain conditions. "First, that the school remains public, serving this community. Second, that current staff retain their positions with improved benefits. And third, that a portion of the renovated building be dedicated to community use, perhaps an arts center or vocational training facility." The room erupted in a mix of disbelief, cautious hope, and lingering skepticism. Dr. Wilkins looked stunned. "Why would you do this?" Frank Delaney asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. "What's your angle, Reed?" It was the question Max had anticipated, the one he'd been asking himself since returning to Westbridge. The easy answer was philanthropy, the wealthy businessman giving back. But standing before the community his mother had worked herself to exhaustion to remain part of, Max opted for honesty. "Lincoln Elementary gave me the foundation that made everything else possible," he said simply. "One person in particular saw potential in me when everyone else saw a problem child. I owe a debt I can never fully repay, but this is a start." His gaze found Rose in the crowd, her expression a complex mixture of pride and something deeper, understanding, perhaps of what his return truly signified. As the meeting continued, Max's proposal was debated vigorously. Not everyone was convinced of his intentions, and significant obstacles remained: zoning issues, school board approvals, coordination with local government. But by the evening's end, a tentative coalition had formed. A committee was established to work with Max's foundation, with Frank Delaney volunteering to serve as community liaison, a development that surprised Max given the man's initial hostility. "Don't mistake me, Reed," Frank said gruffly as the meeting disbanded. "I still don't entirely trust your motives, but I've known Rose Hawkins for 40 years, and if she vouches for you, that counts for something." As Max helped Rose into his car, she'd finally agreed to let his driver take her home after the long evening. She was uncharacteristically quiet. "Did I overstep?" he asked, concerned by her silence. Rose shook her head slowly. No, Max, what you're offering, it's more than generous. It's just... She hesitated. I never meant for you to feel indebted to me. What I did for you all those years ago, any decent person would have done the same. That's where you're wrong, Mrs. Hawkins, Max said gently. Very few people did what you did, see past a child's circumstances to their potential. Fewer still did it with such consistency and kindness. He paused. The foundation, the school, it's not just about repaying a debt. It's about continuing what you started, creating possibilities for others the way you did for me. Rose reached over and patted his hand, a gesture so maternal it momentarily transported Max back to his childhood. Well, she said, with characteristic pragmatism, if you're determined to throw your money at us, I suppose we'd better make sure it's spent wisely. Max laughed, the tension of the evening dissolving. I wouldn't expect anything less, Mrs. Hawkins. As they drove through the darkened streets of Westbridge, Max reflected on how differently this day had unfolded from what he might have planned. For decades, he'd controlled every variable, anticipated every outcome. Here he was navigating unfamiliar territory, community dynamics, emotional investments, solutions that couldn't be engineered with spreadsheets and profit margins. Yet somehow this uncertainty felt right. Necessary even. The walls he'd built around himself, the careful distance he'd maintained from genuine human connection, were beginning to crumble. And in their place, bridges were forming, tentative, but real. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, resistance from the school board, skepticism from his executive team, the 1,000 details required to transform an idea into reality. But tonight, driving through the neighborhood of his childhood with Rose Hawkins beside him, Maxwell Reed felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple satisfaction of taking the first step on a journey worth making. The June evening was unseasonably warm as Max made his way across Lincoln Elementary's athletic field, now transformed into a vibrant community gathering. Colorful streamers hung between makeshift poles, strings of lights twinkled overhead, and the smell of barbecue and sweet treats filled the air. Westbridge's annual summer festival was in full swing, and despite having lived in the neighborhood as a child, Max realized he'd never actually attended. Maxwell Reed, Maggie O'Brien waved from her booth where she was selling homemade jams and preserves. Come try my blueberry jam, family recipe, secret ingredient. Max approached with a smile, noticing how the initial wariness that had greeted him 2 months ago had gradually softened. Not completely, there were still plenty of skeptical glances, but his consistent presence and transparent efforts with the school renovation had begun to shift perceptions. Mrs. O'Brien, he greeted her. These look amazing. Don't sound so surprised, she chuckled, spreading a sample on a small cracker. We might not have fancy Manhattan restaurants, but Westbridge knows good food. Max bit into the cracker and raised his eyebrows in genuine appreciation. This is exceptional. I'll take 4 jars. As Maggie wrapped his purchase, she lowered her voice. Rose is over by the music stage. Been on her feet too long, if you ask me. But you try telling that woman to rest. I'll check on her, Max promised, paying for the jam and deliberately ignoring Maggie's attempt to offer a discount for locals. Making his way through the crowd, Max was struck by the sense of community evident in every interaction. Children ran freely between booths, neighbors called out greetings to each other, and multiple generations mingled with comfortable familiarity. It was a stark contrast to the carefully orchestrated charity galas and networking events that constituted his usual social calendar. Near the small stage where a local band played folk music, he spotted Rose and Emily. Rose was indeed looking tired, though she was smiling as she watched several children attempt a traditional folk dance. Emily sat beside her in her wheelchair, sketching the scene in a small notebook. Ladies, Maxie greeted them, pulling up a folding chair. Enjoying the festival? Emily looked up with a bright smile. Max, I didn't know if you'd make it. Don't you have that big meeting with the school board tomorrow? I do, he confirmed, but I wouldn't miss this. Besides, all work and no play makes for poor strategy. Rose snorted. Is that what they teach you in business school these days? Actually, they teach the opposite, Max admitted. All work, no distractions. I'm unlearning a lot of habits. Young woman approached their group, slightly hesitant. Mr. Reed, I'm Catherine Walsh from the Westbridge community paper. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about the Lincoln Elementary project. Max had been avoiding press inquiries, preferring to let actions speak rather than make promises. That might face unforeseen obstacles, but the earnestness of the young reporter gave him pause. Catherine was my star pupil 3 years ago, Rose interjected proudly. First in her family to go to college, journalism scholarship to Boston University. The young woman blushed. Mrs. Hawkins took care of my little brother after school when my mom had to work late. She's the reason I got that scholarship. Helped me with my application essays every day for a month. Max found himself smiling at yet another example of Rose's quiet influence. In that case, I'd be happy to answer a few questions, Ms. Walsh. Why don't you join us? As Catherine settled in with her notepad, the band finished their set and announced a short break. The festival continued around them, a swirl of activity and communal joy. People are curious about your personal connection to Westbridge, Catherine began. You've been very private about your motivations. Max considered his response carefully. I grew up here. Lincoln Elementary gave me my start, despite challenging circumstances. Mrs. Hawkins, in particular, saw something in me worth nurturing. So, this is about repaying a personal debt. Partly, Max acknowledged, but it's also about recognizing that communities like Westbridge have intrinsic value that can't be measured in property assessments or development potential. The connections here, the history, the way people support each other, these things matter. Catherine scribbled notes, clearly pleased with his candor. You've built your career on urban development projects that have often led to gentrification and displacement. Some might see this project as out of character. Has your philosophy changed? The question was direct, even challenging, but fair. Max respected her for asking it. I'd say my perspective has expanded, he replied thoughtfully. For years, I viewed progress primarily through an economic lens, more development, more prosperity, more opportunity. But I failed to consider what gets lost in that equation, the human cost of disrupting established communities, the value of continuity and connection. And now I'm looking for balance, ways to improve infrastructure, create opportunities, without sacrificing the soul of a place. He gestured to the festival around them. You can't manufacture this. Once it's gone, you can't bring it back with fancy coffee shops and art installations. Catherine nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. One last question. There are rumors that Pinnacle Development has been pressuring the school board to reject your proposal in favor of their condominium project. Any comment? Max tensed. He'd known about Pinnacle's continued interest, but hadn't realized their lobbying had intensified. I can only say that I believe the board will make their decision based on what's best for this community and its children, not external commercial interests. After Catherine left with promises to share her article before publication, Max turned to Rose, who had been listening quietly. Is that true about Pinnacle pressuring the board? She asked. Unfortunately, Max confirmed, their project would generate significant tax revenue for the district, a compelling argument in tight budget times. Emily, who had been sketching throughout the conversation, looked up with concern. What happens if they say no to your foundation? Before Max could respond, the music started again, this time a traditional folk tune that seemed to energize the crowd. Rose's expression brightened immediately. Oh, I haven't heard this in years. The Midsummer Dance. She began tapping her foot to the rhythm. An elderly gentleman approached, extending his hand to Rose with exaggerated formality. Mrs. Hawkins, would you do me the honor? Rose laughed, shaking her head. Frank Delaney, my dancing days are long behind me. Nonsense, Frank insisted. It's tradition. You can't break tradition. To Max's surprise, Rose allowed herself to be pulled to her feet and led toward the area in front of the stage where couples were forming two lines. The dance appeared to be some sort of structured folk tradition with specific steps and patterns. "They've done this every year since forever," Emily explained, noticing Max's curious expression. Grandma taught dance classes at the community center before she started at Lincoln. She was quite famous for it locally. Max watched in amazement as Rose, despite her age and the physical toll of her demanding job, moved through the dance with surprising grace. Her face transformed, years melting away as she followed the familiar patterns with Frank Delaney, who despite his gruff exterior was clearly an experienced dancer himself. "I had no idea," Max murmured. "There's a lot you don't know about her," Emily said, her tone gentle but pointed. "About any of us, really." Max felt the subtle rebuke. Despite 2 months in Westbridge, despite his growing involvement in community affairs, he realized how much of his approach had been transactional. He'd identified problems to solve, resources to allocate, objectives to achieve, viewing the community through the lens of his profession rather than truly immersing himself in its culture and history. As the dance continued, more people joined. In Max recognized faces from community meetings, shop owners who now greeted him by name, parents of Lincoln Elementary students who had initially regarded him with suspicion but now offered cautious acknowledgement. "Would you like to join them?" he asked Emily, nodding toward the dancers. She smiled wistfully. "I can't do those steps anymore, but I love watching. The patterns, the connections. It's like the whole community becomes one organism for a few minutes. I try to capture that feeling in my paintings." Max studied her latest sketch, a remarkably evocative rendering of the dance that somehow conveyed both the physical movements and the emotional resonance of the tradition. "You see things others miss," he observed. "When you can't always participate, you become a better observer," Emily replied with the wisdom that continually surprised him. "That's something you and I have in common, I think." "How so?" "You've been watching from the outside too, analyzing, planning, trying, to help but not really part of things." Her tone held no judgment, only insight. "Tonight's different, though. You're starting to see us as we are, not just as problems to solve." Her perception was uncanny and slightly uncomfortable. Max had built his career on remaining detached, maintaining the objectivity he believed necessary for sound business decisions. Even his philanthropy had followed the same model: identify a need, develop a solution, implement efficiently, move on. Personal investment was messy, unpredictable, potentially compromising. Yet here in Westbridge, that detachment was proving impossible to maintain. Rose, Emily, even cantankerous Frank Delaney, they had become more than beneficiaries of his largesse. They had become people he cared about. As the dance concluded to enthusiastic applause, Rose returned to their seating area, flushed and breathless, but clearly exhilarated. "Margaret would never believe it if she saw me now," she laughed, fanning herself with a paper napkin. "Margaret?" Max asked. "My sister," Rose explained, her expression softening with reminiscence. "She passed on 15 years ago. We used to dance together at these festivals when we were girls. She always said I'd be dancing at my own funeral." The casual mention of her sister, someone Max had never heard of despite his growing familiarity with Rose's life, underscored Emily's point. There were depths to these people, histories and connections he was only beginning to glimpse. "Tell me about her," he found himself saying, "about growing up here, about the Westbridge I never knew as a child." Rose gave him a curious look, perhaps surprised by his genuine interest in history that wasn't directly relevant to his project. Then she began to speak, weaving tales of a Westbridge from decades past, the factories that had employed most of the town before closing in the 1970s, the tight-knit immigrant communities that had supported each other through economic hardships, the traditions like this festival that had sustained community identity through changing times. Max listened, truly listened, as Rose and eventually others who joined their circle shared stories that transformed Westbridge from a development opportunity into a place with a soul. The festival continued around them, but for several hours, Max remained in that circle of storytellers, absorbing a history that would never appear in property records or economic assessments. As the evening wound down and families began to disperse, Frank Delaney approached Max with an unexpected invitation. "Some of us old-timers are gathering at my place for a nightcap. Nothing fancy. Just folks who've known this town longer than most. You should join us, Reed. Might learn something useful for that board meeting tomorrow." Max hesitated, thinking of the presentation he'd planned to review one more time before. The crucial meeting. "Go," Rose encouraged him. "Frank doesn't extend that invitation lightly. Besides, your fancy charts and financial projections won't convince the board. Understanding the heart of this community might." "I'll drive Grandma and Emily home," Catherine Walsh offered, having returned to say goodbye. "My car's adapted for wheelchairs. I used to transport my uncle before he passed." Decision made. Max soon found himself in Frank Delaney's modest but immaculately maintained Victorian home, surrounded by a dozen of Westbridge's elder residents. The gathering had the feel of an informal council. These were the keepers of local memory, the institutional knowledge no official records could capture. "So, Reed," Frank began once everyone had a drink in hand, whiskey for some, tea for others. "Tomorrow you're facing the school board. 7 members, 4 of whom have never set foot in Westbridge and see it only as a liability on the district's balance sheet. What's your strategy?" Put on the spot, Max began outlining his presentation. The financial projections, the architectural renderings, the legal framework for the public-private partnership. Maggie O'Brien interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Numbers and pictures, cold comfort against the promise of tax revenue from luxury condos." "What would you suggest?" Max asked, genuinely curious. "Tell them about Lillian Parker," suggested an elderly man Max hadn't met before. Class of '62, first black valedictorian in the district, became a pediatric surgeon, still sends Christmas cards to the school every year. "Or the Miller twins," Maggie added. "Their parents were undocumented, terrified of institutions. Rose practically adopted those boys. Both college graduates now, one's a teacher right here in the district." One by one they offered stories, not of buildings or programs, but of lives transformed. Children who had found safety within Lincoln's walls when their homes were chaotic. Immigrant families who had gained a foothold in American society through the school's community outreach. Teachers who had stayed for decades despite better paying opportunities elsewhere because they believed in the school's mission. Listening to their testimonials, Max realized they were giving him something more valuable than talking points. They were sharing the true impact of the institution he was fighting to save, not as an abstract concept, but as a living force that had shaped generations. "Bring some of these stories to the board," Frank advised as the evening concluded. "Make them see what they're really deciding on. It's not just a building or a budget line, it's a community anchor." As Max walked back to his rented townhouse, under a sky filled with stars rarely visible in Manhattan's light-polluted atmosphere, he found himself revising his mental presentation. The financial data and legal frameworks were still necessary, but they would no longer be the centerpiece. Instead, he would lead with what he had learned tonight, the human story of Lincoln Elementary and its irreplaceable role in Westbridge. His phone buzzed with a message from Victor, his CFO. "Board of Directors requesting emergency meeting. Shareholders concerned about your extended absence and the Foundation's financial commitments. Getting difficult to manage expectations. Call ASAP." Max slipped the phone back into his pocket without responding. Tomorrow's school board meeting had to take priority. For perhaps the first time in his career, Maxwell Reed was putting something ahead of Reed Enterprises' immediate concerns. The realization should have alarmed him, but instead it felt strangely liberating. That night, lying awake in the unfamiliar quiet of suburban darkness, Max reflected on Emily's observation that he had been watching from the outside. It was true. He had approached Westbridge as he approached all projects, with careful analysis and strategic intervention, maintaining professional distance. But something had shifted tonight among the dancers and storytellers of this community that had shaped him and then continued evolving in his absence. He was no longer merely an observer or benefactor. He was becoming, slowly and almost despite himself, a participant in Westbridge's ongoing story. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him as he finally drifted into sleep, dreaming of folk, dances he'd never learned, and communities he'd never truly been part of until now. The board's decision is final, Mr. Reed. I'm sorry. Superintendent Warren's voice held genuine regret, but his words were resolute. The school board had voted 4-3 against Max's renovation proposal, opting instead for Pinnacle Development's offer to purchase the Lincoln Elementary property for conversion into luxury condominiums. Max stood at the window of his Manhattan office, phone pressed to his ear, watching rain lash against the glass. 3 months into his Westbridge project, and he had just been handed his first significant defeat. The financial incentives were simply too compelling to ignore, Warren continued. The district faces a $15 million deficit next year. Pinnacle's offer solves that problem immediately, whereas your foundation's proposal, while admirable, still required district resources long-term. And the students? The staff? Max asked, already knowing the answer. Students will be redistributed to neighboring schools. Transportation will be provided. As for staff, there will be some consolidation, but we're working to minimize job losses. Meaning Rose would almost certainly lose her position. At 85, with no formal education beyond high school, her prospects for new employment were virtually non-existent. This isn't over, Superintendent, Max said with quiet determination. The community deserves better than this. Warren sighed. I understand your disappointment, Mr. Reed, but I suggest you accept the board's decision gracefully. Not even Maxwell Reed wins every battle. After ending the call, Max remained at the window, unusually indecisive about his next move. He had returned to New York 3 days ago for an emergency board meeting of Reed Enterprises, where he'd faced increasingly pointed questions about his extended absence and his foundation's growing financial commitments. Your primary obligation is to this company and its shareholders, Lawrence Bennett, his lead investor, had reminded him with thinly veiled irritation. This charitable detour has been tolerated long enough. Either return to your responsibilities here, or consider whether it's time for new leadership. The threat was clear, and to his surprise, Max found himself genuinely torn. 6 months ago, the mere suggestion of stepping back from Reed Enterprises would have been unthinkable. The company was his life's work, his identity, the validation of everything he'd struggled to achieve. Now, he was contemplating exactly what sacrifices he was willing to make for Westbridge, a community he had once been desperate to escape. His intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. Mr. Reed, Mr. Hargrove is here for your 2 o'clock. Send him in, Max replied, turning from the window to greet his CFO. Victor Hargrove entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to delivering bad news to powerful people. In 20 years of working together, Victor had never sugar-coated financial realities, a quality Max had always valued until this moment. I've run the numbers on your school proposal as requested, Victor began without preamble, sliding a folder across Max's desk. If we redirect the foundation to purchase the Lincoln property outright, outbidding Pinnacle, we're looking at a significant financial commitment with essentially zero return on investment. Max skimmed the detailed analysis. This assumes we'd need to acquire the property at market value. What about leveraging historical preservation statutes? Lincoln is over 100 years old. Already considered, Victor replied. The building has been too extensively modified over the years to qualify for historical protection. And before you ask, I've examined every possible tax incentive and public-private partnership model. The bottom line remains the same. This is charity, not investment. The blunt assessment hung in the air between them. For decades, Max had evaluated every decision through the same lens Victor was applying. Potential return balanced against risk and resource allocation. It was the mindset that had transformed him from a scholarship student with nothing to his name into one of the wealthiest developers in the country. What if return on investment isn't the only metric that matters? Max mused, more to himself than to Victor. Victor's expression shifted from professional detachment to genuine concern. Max, I've followed you through some high-risk ventures without question, but this is different. You're talking about pouring millions into saving a decrepit school building. in a neighborhood most people couldn't find on a map. For what? Because you feel nostalgic? Because some old janitor was nice to you 40 years ago? The dismissive characterization of Rose sent a flash of anger through Max. That old janitor has done more good with her life on minimum wage than most of us will accomplish with all our millions, Victor. And Westbridge isn't just some neighborhood. It's a community worth preserving. Victor stared at him, clearly taken aback by the uncharacteristic outburst. I didn't mean to offend, he said carefully. I'm just trying to understand what's driving this. This isn't the Maxwell Reed I've known for 20 years. Maybe that's the point, Max replied quietly. Before Victor could respond, Max's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Rose's number. He raised a hand, silently asking Victor to wait, and answered. Mrs. Hawkins, is everything all right? Rose's voice came through, tight with anxiety. Max, where are you? Are you still in New York? Yes, I am. What's happened? It's the storm. They're evacuating low-lying areas of Westbridge. The river's rising faster than anyone expected. They're saying it could be the worst flooding in 50 years. Max swiveled his chair toward the large monitor on his office wall, quickly pulling up weather reports. A massive nor'easter was indeed battering the New England coast, causing widespread flooding and power outages. Where are you now? Are you and Emily safe? We're at the elementary school. They've opened it as an emergency shelter since it's on higher ground. But Max, her voice broke slightly. The apartment building, it's in the evacuation zone, everything we have. The implications were clear. Rose and Emily's apartment, along with all their possessions, Emily's medical equipment, her artwork, was at risk of severe flood damage. Listen carefully, Max said, decision crystallizing instantly. Stay where you are. I'm on my way. My helicopter can get me to Boston despite the weather. I'll be there in 3 hours at most. After assuring Rose he would handle everything, Max ended the call and turned to find Victor watching him with an unreadable expression. You're going back, Victor stated rather than asked. I am, Max confirmed, already reaching for his jacket. Rebecca can reschedule today's meetings. Victor shook his head slowly. Max, the board was explicitly clear yesterday. If you walk out now, then they'll have to make good on their threat, Max finished for him. These people need help, Victor. Not in a week, not after committee reviews and risk assessments, now. For a moment, Victor looked like he might argue further. Instead, he simply nodded. I'll hold things together here as long as I can. But Max, he hesitated. Be sure this is what you really want. Max paused at the door, reflecting on the question. Was this what he wanted? To risk the empire he'd spent decades building for a community he'd once desperately wanted to escape, for people who, until recently, had regarded him with suspicion, if not outright hostility. It is, he said simply, and was surprised to discover he meant it. By the time Max's helicopter touched down at a private airfield outside Boston, the storm had intensified. The drive to Westbridge, normally less than an hour, took nearly 2 as his driver navigated flooded roads and downed trees. Night had fallen, making conditions even more treacherous. But Max's thoughts remained focused on the community facing this disaster and on how he could best help. Lincoln Elementary came into view, its windows glowing with emergency lighting against the darkened sky. The parking lot had been transformed into a makeshift command center, with emergency vehicles, National Guard trucks, and volunteers moving purposefully through the rain. Max was met at the entrance by Dr. Wilkins, her usual professional composure strained by the crisis at hand. Mr. Reed, I didn't expect to see you here. How bad is it? He asked, shaking rain from his coat. Worst flooding in decades, she replied, leading him through corridors now lined with cots and displaced families. The older section of town by the river is already under 2 feet of water. They're predicting another 3 feet by morning if the rain doesn't let up. How many people have been evacuated? About 300 so far. We're the primary shelter, but we're already over capacity. The community center and St. Andrew's Church are taking overflow, but they're in areas that might need evacuation too if the flooding worsens. Max scanned the crowded gymnasium as they entered. Families huddled on cots and folding chairs, volunteers distributed food and blankets, and a medical station had been set up in one corner. The atmosphere was tense but orderly, a community rallying in crisis. He spotted Rose and Emily near the medical station, where Emily appeared to be helping an elderly couple fill out forms. Rose was organizing blankets, her efficiency evident even in emergency conditions. Despite her age and the chaos around her, she moved with purpose, offering comfort and practical help where needed. "Max!" Emily called out when she saw him, her face lighting up with relief. "You actually came?" "Of course I came," he replied, making his way to them through the crowded room. "Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Rose assured him, though the fatigue in her eyes belied her words. "Others have it much worse. The Martinez family lost everything when the river broke through the levee, and poor Mrs. Johnson, 92 years old, and had to be carried out of her home of 60 years. Max noted how even in crisis, Rose's thoughts were for others rather than herself. "What about your apartment?" he asked gently. Her expression faltered slightly. "In the flood zone. They're saying all the ground floor units are already underwater." She straightened her shoulders. "But we're safe, and that's what matters. Things can be replaced." Except they couldn't, not easily. Max knew Rose lived on the ground floor because stairs were increasingly difficult for her, and that accommodating Emily's wheelchair had required sacrificing what little storage space they had. Their most precious possessions, family photos, Emily's artwork, Rose's few keepsakes, would all be at risk. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge of the emergency response," Max said decisively. Emily and Rose exchanged glances. "That would be Chief Parker," Emily offered. "He's over by the entrance, coordinating with the National Guard." Max found Chief Parker, a weathered man in his 50s who carried the weight of responsibility visibly in his stance. After brief introductions, Max got straight to the point. "What resources do you need most urgently?" Parker sized him up, clearly assessing whether this well-dressed outsider was offering genuine help or empty promises. "Everything. More shelter space, portable generators, medical supplies, boats for water rescues. Take your pick." "Consider it done," Max replied. "I can have generators and additional emergency supplies here within hours. As for shelter, my townhouse is on higher ground and can accommodate at least 30 people. I'd like to prioritize the elderly and those with medical needs." Parker's skepticism visibly receded. "That would make a significant difference, Mr. Reed, thank you." "One more thing," Max continued. "I need a team to secure specific items from evacuated homes, if it can be done safely. Personal documents, irreplaceable belongings, starting with the Cedar Street apartments." "Where Mrs. Hawkins lives," Parker noted, his expression softening slightly. "We've been focusing on getting people out, not possessions. But I can spare 2 men with a boat if you're willing to go with them. At your own risk, of course." "Absolutely," Max agreed without hesitation. An hour later, dressed in borrowed waders and a National Guard rain poncho, Max found himself in a small rescue boat navigating what had once been Cedar Street. The water level had risen to nearly 4 feet, submerging cars and flowing through the first floors of homes and businesses. The rain continued relentlessly, illuminated by the boat's powerful spotlight as they made their way toward Rose's apartment building. "You sure about this?" "Sir?" asked Sergeant Reynolds, the National Guard officer manning the boat. "Water's still rising. We don't have much time." "I'm sure," Max confirmed. "Apartment 103, ground floor, east side of the building." The boat bumped gently against the submerged staircase leading to Rose's apartment complex. Max and Reynolds waded through chest-high water to reach the building's entrance, forcing the door open against the pressure of the flood. Inside, the water was slightly lower, but still well above waist height. Flashlights cut through the darkness as they navigated the flooded hallway to Rose's apartment. The door was unlocked. She'd left in haste when the evacuation order came. "What exactly are we looking for?" Reynolds asked, sweeping his light across the surreal scene of furniture floating in the murky water. Max had a mental list prepared from his conversation with Rose and Emily. Medical documents in the top drawer of the bedroom dresser, a fireproof box under the bed containing birth certificates and insurance papers, and as many of the paintings as we can salvage, they'll be stacked in the second bedroom. They worked quickly, the urgency of their mission compounded by the steadily rising water and occasional ominous creaks from the building's structure. Reynolds located the document box while Max carefully gathered Emily's paintings, wrapping them in plastic garbage bags from the kitchen to protect them from the rain. As he secured the last painting, Max's flashlight illuminated a small wooden chest on a high shelf just above the waterline. Something about it caught his attention. It seemed older than the rest of Rose's modest possessions, lovingly preserved despite its evident age. "One more item," he called to Reynolds, wading across to retrieve the chest. With their salvage, mission complete, they made their way back to the boat, now laden with documents, paintings, and the mysterious chest. As they pulled away from the building, Max glanced back at the apartment complex, now dark and partially submerged, a sobering reminder of how quickly security could be swept away. By midnight, Max's townhouse had been transformed into an auxiliary shelter. The elderly and those with medical needs had been transferred from the overcrowded school, with doctors and nurses volunteering their services. Max had opened every room, including his own bedroom, to accommodate as many people as possible. In the kitchen, which had become an impromptu command center, Max coordinated with his Manhattan office via satellite phone. The cellular networks were down throughout much of the area. Rebecca, his executive assistant, had mobilized Reed Enterprises' considerable resources, arranging for emergency supplies, medical equipment, and disaster relief specialists to be transported to Westbridge. The first truck should arrive by dawn, Rebecca informed him. "I've also contacted our insurance division to set up an emergency processing center for flood claims." "Excellent work," Max approved. "What about the board meeting?" There was a slight pause. "Mr. Bennett was displeased by your departure. He's called for an emergency shareholder meeting next week." The implication was clear. His position as CEO was in jeopardy. Strangely, the news affected Max less than he would have expected even a month ago. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," he said. "For now, these people are the priority." After ending the call, Max made his way through the crowded house, checking on the evacuees and ensuring the volunteer staff had everything they needed. In the library, he found Rose sitting beside the wooden chest he'd retrieved from her apartment, her expression pensive. "You found it," she said softly as he entered. "I thought for sure it would be lost." "What is it?" Max asked, settling into a chair beside her. Rose ran her hand gently over the chest's worn surface. "Memories. Nothing valuable to anyone but me." She unlatched the lid, revealing a collection of papers, small keepsakes, and photographs. 45 years at Lincoln Elementary, all the children I watched grow up, including you." She rummaged through the contents, eventually extracting a faded construction paper card. "Your Valentine's Day card. 2nd grade. You were so proud of it." Max stared at the simple red heart, cut unevenly and decorated with excessive glitter, clearly the work of a child's unpracticed hands. His name was written in the careful block letters of someone just learning to write. "I didn't think you'd keep something like this," he said, genuinely surprised. "I kept something from all my special ones," Rose explained. "The children who needed a little extra care, a little extra love." She continued sorting through the chest, producing more artifacts, a small trophy from a science fair, newspaper clippings of student achievements, letters from former students now grown. "You've touched so many lives," Max observed, humbled by the evidence of her quiet impact. Rose smiled softly. "That's the real wealth, isn't it? Not buildings or bank accounts, but the lives you've been part of." She looked at him directly. "I think you're starting to understand that." Before Max could respond, Dr. Wilkins appeared in the doorway, her expression grave. "Mr. Reed, we have a situation. The school's roof is beginning to leak significantly. We are concerned about structural integrity if the rain continues." The news was alarming, but not entirely unexpected. The structural assessment had already identified the roof as a critical weakness, one of the key reasons for the renovation plan. "How many people are still sheltering there?" "About 200, Dr. Wilkins replied. "We've moved the most vulnerable. Here and to other locations, but we're running out of alternatives. Max considered the options quickly. My office has located 3 coach buses that can reach us by morning. We can transport people to Boston if necessary, where I have arrangements with several hotels. And in the meantime? Max made a decision that would have been unthinkable to him just months ago. Contact Chief Parker. Tell him I'm offering my Manhattan penthouse as a temporary command center. It can be ready to receive evacuees within hours. My helicopter can begin transporting the most urgent cases immediately. Dr. Wilkins's composure momentarily faltered. Are your personal residence in New York? It has 20 rooms sitting empty, Max replied simply. What better use for it? After Dr. Wilkins departed to relay the offer, Rose regarded Max with a mixture of pride and wonder. Your fancy penthouse filled with flood refugees. I imagine that's not what you had in mind when you bought it. No, Max admitted with a rueful smile, but buildings should serve people, not the other way around. Another lesson I'm learning rather late in life. Rose reached over and patted his hand. Never too late to learn the important things, Max. Never too late. Throughout the night, Max coordinated relief efforts, made countless calls, and helped wherever an extra pair of hands was needed. As dawn approached, he found himself on the front porch of his townhouse, watching the rain finally begin to slacken. The first emergency supply trucks from Reed Enterprises were arriving, their headlights cutting through the mist. Emily joined him, wrapped in a blanket against the early morning chill. You haven't slept at all, have you? She observed. I'll sleep when everyone's safe, Max replied, suppressing a yawn. The whole town's talking about what you've done, Emily said quietly. Opening your home, bringing in supplies, even saving Grandma's memory box and my paintings. She hesitated. They're saying maybe they were wrong about you. And what do you say? Max asked, curious about her perspective. Emily considered the question thoughtfully. I think maybe you were wrong about yourself, all those years building skyscrapers and making millions, when what you really wanted was to build something that mattered, something real. Her insight, struck uncomfortably close to truths Max was only beginning to acknowledge. His empire of glass and steel had brought him wealth and influence, but not connection or purpose. Here in Westbridge, amidst crisis and hardship, he had found something his success had never provided, meaningful impact on individual lives. You're wise beyond your years, Emily Hawkins, he said finally. She smiled. Grandma's influence. As they watched the relief workers unloading supplies, Max's satellite phone rang. It was Victor Hargrove, his voice tense with urgency. Max, the board has moved up the emergency meeting. Bennett has enough proxy votes to force a confidence vote. If you're not back in New York by noon, you'll likely be removed as CEO. The moment of reckoning had arrived sooner than expected. Max glanced at the activity around him, the community, coming together, the relief efforts beginning to gain momentum, the hope slowly replacing fear in the eyes of Westbridge residents. I won't be there, Victor, he said with calm certainty. These people need me more than Reed Enterprises does right now. Max, be reasonable. You're about to lose everything you've built. No, Max replied, watching as Rose emerged from the house to help distribute blankets to newly arrived evacuees. Despite her exhaustion, she moved with the same quiet dignity and sense of purpose she'd always possessed. I'm about to find out what I can build that truly matters. As the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting golden light over the flood-ravaged town, Maxwell Reed made peace with his decision. Whatever came next, whether he remained CEO of his company or not, he knew with absolute certainty that Westbridge was where he needed to be. Autumn painted Westbridge in brilliant hues of red and gold as Max stood on the freshly laid cobblestone path leading to the renovated Lincoln Elementary School. 6 months had passed since the devastating flood, 6 months of rebuilding, renewing, and reimagining the future of a community that had, against all expectations, become his home. Nervous? Emily asked, maneuvering her wheelchair alongside him. Her new custom chair, designed with input from specialists Max had consulted, allowed her far greater independence and mobility than her previous equipment. Surprisingly, yes, Max admitted, adjusting his tie. The grand reopening ceremony would begin in less than an hour, with local officials, media, and most importantly, the entire Westbridge community in attendance. I've opened billion-dollar skyscrapers with less anxiety. Emily laughed. Those were just buildings. This is something more. She was right, of course. The structure before them represented far more than brick, steel, and glass. It was the culmination of a journey that had transformed not just Lincoln Elementary, but Max himself. The changes in his life had been seismic. 3 days after the flood, while Max was still coordinating relief efforts in Westbridge, the Reed Enterprises board had indeed voted to remove him as CEO, a development that had made national business news. Reed out, billionaire developer abandons empire for flood relief. The headlines had proclaimed, painting him as either irresponsibly sentimental or admirably humanitarian, depending on the publication's perspective. The truth, as usual, was more complex. Max had not abandoned his company. He remained its largest shareholder and a board member, but he had chosen to relinquish day-to-day control to focus on what had become his mission, rebuilding Westbridge and revolutionizing the Lincoln Elementary School model. "Mr. Reed," Dr. Wilkins called, emerging from the school's gleaming new entrance. "The governor just arrived and the mayor would like to review the program one last time if you have a moment." "Of course," Max replied, giving Emily's shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading toward the administrative wing, a striking addition to the original structure, designed to complement rather than overshadow the school's historic architecture. Inside, the transformation was even more apparent. What had once been deteriorating classrooms were now state-of-the-art learning environments. The old gymnasium had been converted into a community health center that would provide services to both students and residents. A new wing housed the Emily Hawkins Arts Center, complete with adaptive equipment to ensure accessibility for artists of all abilities. As Max walked the polished corridors, he reflected on the journey that had made this revival possible. After the flood, when the school board's decision to sell to Pinnacle seemed irreversible, an unexpected discovery had changed everything. During cleanup efforts, workers had uncovered a remarkable historical treasure beneath the school's foundations, artifacts and structural elements dating back to one of the earliest educational institutions in Massachusetts, established in 1749. The finding had qualified the site for emergency historical preservation status, halting Pinnacle's development plans and opening the door for Max's foundation to acquire the property. The Reed Community Foundation had purchased not just the school but several surrounding blocks damaged beyond repair by the flood, transforming the area into a mixed-use development that prioritized affordable housing, community spaces, and small local businesses. Unlike typical gentrification projects, existing residents received priority for the new housing units, with subsidized rates ensuring they wouldn't be priced out of their own neighborhood. "There you are," Mayor Collins greeted Max as he entered the administrative office. "Man of the hour." Max smiled but deflected the praise. "Hardly. This has been a community effort from the beginning." "False modesty doesn't suit you, Reed," the mayor replied good-naturedly. "But we can argue about credit later. Right now, we've got a ribbon to cut and some very excited children waiting to see their new school." The ceremony that followed exceeded even Max's expectations. Students performed songs, community leaders gave speeches praising the collaborative spirit that had made the renovation possible, and the governor presented a proclamation declaring Lincoln Elementary, a model for community-centered education in the state. When it was Max's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief, focusing not on his contribution, but on the resilience of Westbridge and the extraordinary educators who had maintained Lincoln's spirit through decades of challenges. As he concluded, he asked Rose to join him at the podium, a request she had initially refused, but finally accepted after considerable persuasion. "Lincoln Elementary stands today because of people like Rose Hawkins," Max told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the school's new courtyard. "People who understand that education isn't just about buildings or budgets or test scores. It's about seeing potential in every child who walks through these doors. About creating a place where learning happens not just in classrooms, but in moments of kindness, in examples of integrity, in demonstrations of what it means to be part of something larger than yourself. Rose, standing beside him with tears in her eyes, received a standing ovation that continued for several minutes. Students past and present approached to embrace her, many sharing stories of how her quiet influence had shaped their lives. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests began touring the renovated facilities, Max found himself momentarily alone in the main corridor. The building hummed with excited voices and the promise of new beginnings, but he paused to appreciate the quiet triumph the moment represented. "A soft," voice interrupted his reflection. Pretty impressive for a troublemaker who used to hide in the janitor's closet. Max turned to find Catherine Walsh, the young reporter from the Westbridge community paper, who had covered the school's journey, from imminent closure to innovative rebirth. "Just finding a different closet to hide in these days," he joked, gesturing to his modest office off the main hallway, a stark contrast to the palatial executive suite he had occupied in Manhattan. Catherine smiled. "I've been following up on that profile piece about your transition from corporate titan to community builder. People are still trying to make sense of it all. The business world seems to think you've lost your mind." "And what do you think?" Max asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I think," she considered carefully, "that you found something that success couldn't give you. A place to belong." Her insight struck him as remarkably similar to Emily's observations during the flood. Perhaps it was that obvious to outside observers, the emptiness he had been trying to fill with achievement and acquisition, the fundamental disconnection that had defined his existence until Westbridge pulled him back to his roots. "You may be right," he acknowledged. "Though I wouldn't recommend my particular path to everyone, there are less dramatic ways to discover what matters." Catherine laughed. "Like not waiting 40 years to come home?" "Something like that," Max agreed. Their conversation was interrupted by Emily, who wheeled up with excitement evident in her expression. "Max, you have to come see. The first exhibition is installed in the Arts Center, and they've put my River series as the centerpiece." The Emily Hawkins Arts Center had become a cornerstone of the renovated school, a space where students and community members could explore creativity together, with particular emphasis on adaptive arts for those with disabilities. Emily, whose artistic talents had flourished with proper equipment and mentorship, now served as its first artist in residence, while pursuing her degree through a specialized program Max had helped establish with a nearby college. "Lead the way," Max told, her excusing himself to Catherine. The reporter watched them go, making notes for what would undoubtedly become another chapter in the ongoing story of Westbridge's renaissance and the unlikely catalyst who had made it possible. That evening, once the ceremony concluded and the excited students and families had departed, a smaller gathering assembled in the school's new community room. The space had been designed with input from Rose herself, comfortable yet practical, with large windows overlooking the courtyard and walls lined with photographs documenting the school's long history. To Lincoln Elementary, Frank Delaney proposed, raising his glass of sparkling cider, "May it stand another 100 years. To Westbridge," Maggie O'Brien added, "stronger than any flood." To New Beginnings, Dr. Wilkins contributed with a smile. Rose, seated in a place of honor with Emily beside her, looked around the circle of faces. Longtime residents who had initially regarded Max with suspicion now counted him as an ally and friend. The transformation went beyond buildings and infrastructure. It represented a community reclaiming its identity and future. "Your turn, Max," Rose prompted gently. "What shall we toast to?" Max considered the question, looking at the woman who had set this entire journey in motion with small acts of kindness toward a troubled child decades ago. "To full circles," he said finally, "and to the people who help us find our way back to what matters." As glasses clinked and conversation flowed around him, Max felt a contentment that had eluded him throughout his years of financial success. His phone rarely rang these days with urgent business matters. Victor Hargrove had proven a capable CEO for Reed Enterprises, implementing a more balanced approach to development that incorporated many of the lessons Max had learned in Westbridge. Instead, Max's days were filled with community meetings, educational initiatives, and the hands-on work of rebuilding not just buildings, but lives. He had purchased a modest house not far from the school, the renovated Victorian on Maple Street, that had once been his childhood dream home, admired from afar during his impoverished youth. The irony wasn't lost on him. After decades of acquiring penthouse apartments and beachfront villas he rarely visited, he had found home in the very community he had once been desperate to escape. As the gathering began to disperse, Rose approached Max, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, her concession to age and the arthritis that had worsened over the past months. At 86, she had finally retired from her custodial position, though she remained a daily presence at Lincoln Elementary as a volunteer, grandmother in residence, offering wisdom and warmth to a new generation of students. "Walk with me a moment," she requested. Max offered his arm, and they made their way slowly through the quiet corridors of the school. Display cases showcased student achievements, community, history, and the architectural elements salvaged from the original building. The old blended seamlessly with the new, honoring the past while embracing the future. "I've been meaning to give you something," Rose said as they paused by a large window overlooking the playground. Now an inclusive space designed for children of all abilities. From her pocket, she withdrew a small, well-worn key. "This was in that chest you saved during the flood. I thought you should have it." Max accepted the key with confusion. "What does it open?" "The old janitor's closet," Rose explained with a twinkle in her eye. "The one where you used to hide when things got too much. Stanley, the head custodian back then, gave me a key after finding you there the third time. Said I had a better touch with the troubled ones." The memories surfaced vividly. The small, dimly lit space that had served as his refuge from bullies and the chaos of his home life. Rose finding him there, not scolding or forcing him out, but sitting quietly beside him until he was ready to face the world again. "We kept that closet, you know," Rose continued, "during the renovation. It's a quiet room now, for children who need a moment of peace. But the door is the original one, still has the same lock." The symbolism of the gesture wasn't lost on Max. This small key represented not just a physical space, but the beginning of his connection to Rose, the first time someone had respected his boundaries while still offering presence and support. "Thank you," he said simply, closing his hand around the key. "For this, for everything." Rose patted his arm. "You were always meant for something special, Max. I just helped you see it in yourself." As they completed their circuit of the building and rejoined Emily, who was waiting patiently with Dr. Wilkins, Max felt the weight of the key in his pocket, a tangible reminder of how far he had come and the unexpected path that had led him back to his beginnings. "Ready to go home?" Emily asked as Dr. Wilkins helped Rose with her coat. "Yes," Max replied, a content smile settling on his features. Definitely ready for home. The small group made their way out of the school, pausing briefly to look back at the illuminated building against the darkening sky, a beacon of community resilience and renewed purpose. Max thought of the troubled boy he had once been, hiding in the janitor's closet, dreaming of escape. How strange and beautiful that his journey had ultimately led him back here, not to escape, but to belong. As they walked together through the autumn evening, leaves crunching beneath their feet and the first stars appearing overhead, Reed knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found what his years of wealth and success had never provided, a place where his presence mattered not for what he owned or controlled, but for who he was and what he contributed. In helping to rebuild Westbridge, he had rebuilt himself. In saving Lincoln Elementary, he had honored not just Rose's influence but his own roots. And in choosing connection over empire, he had discovered that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in purpose, a lesson Rose Hawkins had been teaching all along to anyone wise enough to learn. "You know," Emily said thoughtfully as they neared the intersection where their paths would separate, "Grandma always says people come into our lives for a reason. Sometimes we don't understand the reason until years later." "Your grandmother is a very wise woman," Max replied. "She also says," Emily continued with a mischievous smile, "that you're still welcome for Sunday dinner, even if you are a big-shot community savior now." Max laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet street. I wouldn't miss it for anything in the world, and he meant it. The board meetings, the investment portfolios, the endless pursuit of more that had defined his existence for decades, all had receded in importance. Sunday dinners at Rose's new apartment, first floor of a fully accessible building funded by his foundation, community events, mentoring sessions with Lincoln students, and the daily work of building something lasting had become the framework of a life richer than he could have imagined. As Max bid goodnight to Rose and Emily at their building, promising to return the following day to help hang additional artwork in Emily's studio space, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him to this moment. Her chance email about a school closing, a reunion with a woman who had shown kindness to a forgotten child, a community in crisis that had needed precisely the resources and skills he possessed. Coincidence, perhaps, or something more meaningful, the universe conspiring to bring him full circle, back to where his journey had begun, to complete the lessons left unfinished. Walking the final blocks to his home, Maxwell Reed, no longer defined by buildings bearing his name or the fortune he had amassed, felt the cool autumn air fill his lungs and the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent in service to what truly mattered. The path ahead was not marked by acquisition or achievement, but by connection and contribution, a different kind of success than he had pursued for most of his life, but infinitely more fulfilling. And that, he reflected, as he climbed the steps to his front porch, was the most unexpected discovery of all. That after a lifetime of searching for significance in expansion and accumulation, he had found it instead in returning to his roots, in the simple act of giving back to the community that had first shaped him. In the quiet evening, as lights flickered on in windows throughout Westbridge and families gathered around dinner tables, Maxwell Reed finally understood what Rose had been teaching him all along, that the measure of a life well lived lies not in what you possess, but in the lives you touch and the legacy you leave behind. It was a lesson worth coming home for,